Erev Tov again, everybody. Our topic is Kivurat Yaakov, the burial of Jacob. And no shocking revelations in Rav Meidan here, but he has a couple of, I think, clarifying points that shed some light, raise some questions. There are a couple of good articles on the Torah.com that add additional data to the sort of questions about. Rav Meidan deals less with the question of why Yaakov was buried where he was buried. He touches on the question of why they went the way they went to his burial. A lot more discussion is made in other places about the sort of funeral procession and ceremonies that are done along the way. He touches on that as well. So Kfurat Yaakov, the burial of Yaakov, starting with psukim from the beginning of our Parashah, chapter 47, verses 29 to 31. Vayikrevu Yemei Yisrael Amut, Yisrael, another name for Yaakov, as we know, his days drew near to die. He called his son Yosef and said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, place your hand below my thigh, perform an act, chesed ve'emet, loving kindness and truth with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt. Let me lay with my fathers, carry me to Egypt, carry me from Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he, Yosef, said, Anochi asech idvarecha, I will do according to your words. Yaakov further says, swear to me. And Yosef swore to him. And again, Yaakov is described here as Yisrael, bowed at or to the head of the bed. As we mentioned at the end of davening this morning, earlier in this little section, we're told that Yaakov, Vayitchazek Yisrael Vayeshev al Hamita. He sat up in the bed as Yosef approached, and now he sort of further, energizes himself to bow in gratitude and confirmation, all kind of upon his deathbed. So Rav Meidan begins. Yaakov adjures Yosef through the placing of a hand under the thigh regarding the matter of burial with his, Yaakov's, forefathers. What was the need for an oath? The simple answer is that the need for an oath points to the difficulty in fulfilling this wish. Are we right? In other words, something easy, you don't necessarily ask someone to swear to you that they're going to do it. But if you're asking them to swear to you that they're going to do it, there presumably are some difficulties associated with it. Rav Meidan's question is, what are the difficulties? Are we talking here about a spiritual, emotional challenge, a technical challenge, or maybe some of each? The fulfillment of this technical challenge emerges from the psukim when it's actually time for Yaakov to be buried. Says that Yosef told the house of Paro, saying, if I have found favor in your eyes, right? So this is what passes on that language. Yaakov says to him, if I found favor in your eyes, fulfill this wish. Now Yosef needs to seek, a favor in the same way. And he turns to Paro's house and says, if I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Paro directly, saying, my father adjured me, saying, I'm dying. And, in the grave which I established for myself in the land of Canaan, there please bury me, end quote. And now I want to go bury my father and I'll come back. That's the message that Yosef is asking Beit Paro to request of Paro. They do, and Paro responds with the answer, go up and bury your father according to the way he adjured you. So Rav Meidan is zeroing in on the emphasis on the oath and says Yosef and Paro both mention the oath as a ilutz, as a compelling factor, kind of almost against their will. They're both bound to heed it because of its severity. Were it not for the oath, we could doubt whether Paro would have approved Yosef's going to the land of Canaan and burying Yaakov there. Again, this suggests to us that oaths were taken very, very seriously in the ancient world, and they could, the respect that was accorded to oaths would cause someone to do something they might not otherwise do. Now, why? What was problematic about taking Yaakov out of Egypt to bury him in Canaan? Rashi and the Midrash hang this on the Egyptians' wish to keep Yaakov's body, his corpse, with them. That's the approach of Rashi and the Midrash. Another possibility is that the journey to bury Yaakov in the land of Canaan was almost nearly impossible from a political and military perspective, as it says further on, describing the actual journey now that Paro has granted permission. Horsemen and chariots went up with him, and it was a very heavy entourage. They came to Goren Ha'atad, which was on the one side or the other. It's not totally clear, but the presumption is the east side of the Jordan. And they eulogized him there, a very heavy, significant eulogizing. And presumably Yosef, observed for his father a 7-day mourning. It's one of the sources for the idea of Shiva. And the Canaanite residents of the land saw this heavy mourning that was taking place in Goren Ha'atad, this place just at the other side, seemingly, of the Jordan River. And they said, this is a heavy mourning, grave mourning for Egypt. And therefore, they called the name of the place the mourning of Egypt on the side of the Jordan River. We learn two things from these psukim, says Rav Meidan. First of all, there was a need for a military, convoy, escort of significance for Yaakov's, bier, for his coffin, and it seems like, maybe the path or the opportunity to go up to bury had been blocked or, limited in some way, such that you had to travel with armed forces. Second, the route to Marat HaMachpelah passes through Goren Ha'atad, which is on the east side of the Jordan, very similar to the path of travel that Bnei Israel took to Eretz Canaan when they left Egypt. The normal course of travel, which would go through Philistine territory to Har Hebron, presumably was blocked as well, right? Otherwise, why wouldn't they have gone that way? We know that the Torah makes a point in Beshalach, when the Jewish people go out of Egypt, of explaining that why they didn't go Derech Eretz Plishtim Ki Karovu, the path of the Philistines up the Mediterranean coast from Egypt, despite its being closer, because God said if they encounter military opposition along the way, they're going to turn around and go back to Egypt. Barring that explanation here, we don't have any clear indication of why they didn't go that shorter route. And so all we can say is there must have been some other kind of block to going that way. So all of that is to say, in addition, again, to Rashi and the Midrash's answer, that, the reason that there was the need for an oath to add a level of compulsion to being able to bury Yaakov in Canaan, in addition to Rashi and the Midrash's reason that was because the Egyptians would want to keep him in Egypt out of respect or whatever other reasons. An alternative explanation is because people needed to be compelled by oath because there were great challenges embedded in the journey. The normal route had obstacles, and even the burial itself had obstacles or challenges. Despite the difficulties, and again, I think these are things which not great chidushim, but the close reading of the text, often we just sort of look at it as pomp and circumstance and giving Yaakov great honor. But Rav Meidan is drawing our attention to the fact that when you combine the whole oath dimension, which doesn't seem to be necessary, unless it were a straightforward, request, with some of the details of the pomp and circumstance, which include military, you could construct this story. Again, we could always offer other explanations. Yaakov was a father of a statesman, so maybe military honors, even if he didn't serve in the military, could be an appropriate way to dignify him. But this is Ramadan's suggestion that it indicates the fact that actually they needed to defend themselves to get there. Despite the difficulties, and in the merit of the oath, the funeral procession, made it, and Yaakov was buried with his ancestors in the cave of Machpelah. Maybe we could say that the difficulty of bringing Yaakov from Egypt to the land of Canaan actually was a kind of a ma'aseh avot siman labanim, a kind of a what happens to the parent generation is an omen or a sign, an indication of what will happen to future generations that foretells something that was going to happen when they went out from Egypt. Let's compare the psukim. So we have our psukim. Yosef went up to bury his father and all of Paro's servants, the elders of his house, and the elders of Egypt went with him. All of the house of Yosef, his brothers, his father's house, the only things they left in the land of Goshen were their young children and their flocks. When Bnei Israel are getting ready to leave Egypt, or Moshe is still trying to convince Paro to let them out, Paro says, okay, go serve God, as Moshe has been saying, let us go serve God. And Paro says, go serve God, but just leave your sheep and your flocks. Your young children can also go with you. So we have these sort of similar circumstances of kind of who goes and who gets left, and the requirement to leave something in each case. And we want to sort of, well, we could sort of learn in either direction. But what Rav Meidan is suggesting is posing the question, looking backwards from Paro's demand to leave something in Egypt, when Moshe wants to go forward and serve God with Bnei Israel, says, were Yosef's brothers forced to leave their children and possessions in the land of Egypt as a kind of a guarantee to the fact that Yosef would actually come back to Egypt? We have no clear answer to this question, but by saying that, he's saying we can offer this additional supposition that part of, maybe the oath was necessary not just because of, if we take Rashi and the Midrash's answer, the desire to keep Yaakov there, but just the desire to be sure that actually Yosef would return. Okay, going a little further. As was said above, it's possible that the difficulty in bearing Yaakov in Marat Machpelah was also a spiritual, emotional, maybe emotional is better here, actually, an emotional difficulty. Yaakov, when he asks Yosef to bury him in Marat Machpelah and asks him to take that oath, goes on and continues to kind of narrate to him. And he says, as for me, when I was coming from Padan, Rachel died upon me in the land of Canaan on the way. Hard phrase to translate, but od kivrat eretz, either it's a distance, or while there was still some way to go to Ephrat, and I buried her there on the road of or to Ephrat, that is Beit Lechem. Rashi explains that Yaakov is apologizing for the fact that he couldn't bring her to Marat Machpelah even though he wanted to, and that Yosef shouldn't interpret her burial along the way as somehow, a degrading of her. But it's possible that even if there was no kind of degradation in the burial of Rachel on the way to Ephrat, Yosef certainly would have preferred to bring Yaakov after his death to the land of Israel and bury him alongside Rachel, Yosef's mother, the one who was Yaakov's preferred primary wife. So Yaakov is adjuring Yosef, that despite the kind of separation after death, he still wants to be buried alongside Leah, together with his, parent, father and grandfather, his paternal ancestors, Abraham and Yitzchak. It seems like it's for this reason. Actually, this is a good pausing point just for a moment. If anyone wants to react to the sort of the first main point, which is sort of his analysis of the political and geographic factors along the lines of the reasons for the difficulty in burying Yaakov where he wanted to be buried that precipitated the oath being necessary. Happy to take questions, comments, reactions to that before we get to the more familial. Lance, go ahead.
What's the connection? I'm sure I know he makes it, but what would your connection be between the hand under the thigh of Abraham and the hand under the thigh of Joseph?
Yeah. I mean, he will talk briefly about that, about sort of the question of, linking to Brit Milah and to covenantal responsibility. That was compelling to me. I don't know if there's a additional special link between these as the kind of bookends of the patriarchal period, but what are your thoughts, Lance?
Good point. It seems to me that there is or I've read that these things are supposed to be related to procreation, and testimonial is testes kind of thing. And there's a connection between I guess the whole thing is just the continuation of the Jewish people. And actually, the point that fascinates me most here is not that. The point that fascinates me most is the embalming of both Jacob and Joseph. And there's a tremendous amount of information about Egyptian mummification. My personal thought is that mummification is an attempted transition from this world to the next world. And I would suggest that the Jewish equivalent would be Enoch's becoming Metatron and Elijah's becoming Sandalphon. Those are Kabbalistic terms. And here the idea is that I guess Machpelah or whatever is some kind of orchard, where they end up in the orchard, like Rabbi Akiva and Asher and all those guys. But I don't think there's that much in the Torah about the next life, right? I mean, you have to get to
correct, for sure.
You have to get to another a later time.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the mummification is fascinating. There's another the Torah.com article on that as well. So
yes, I've read that article. It's
great.
The long. You're talking about the long article.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting article. Right.
Thank you, David L.
Yeah, I want to go back to the question of oaths and how the oath is made, because it just calls out. And I think that there are two issues. One is the issue of agency, that in both the case of Yosef and in the case of Eliezer, that they're asked to do something and they're not being supervised. In the case of Yosef, right, Yaakov is already going to be dead. In the case of Eliezer, Abraham doesn't know when or how this is going to happen, but he's sending him off to do something in a way that can't easily be monitored. But the second piece is that they're both being asked to do something, and this is really building on Rav Meidan's point. They're both being asked to do something against their natural interest. Up until this point, Eliezer is the presumed successor of the house. And over here, it's Rav Meidan's so right. The place where Yosef would want to take and bury Yaakov would be next to his biological mother. And so the intensity of the shvuah, the oath that they're being asked to take, is underscored by the physical ritual that's being associated with it.
Yeah. Beautiful. I think that's nice. And it's, it's interesting just in the amount of ink Rav Meidan gives to the different points here. I think that what he calls the koshi nafshi, maybe resonates the most, even though he mentions it almost in passing. but I think you expressed it further very well and made a really nice connection to the earlier case of Avraham and his Eved, as Lance referenced. So excellent. Let's go on further. Okay, and now we'll come to Rav Meidan's comments in this account. It seems like it's for this reason that the oath comes upon or below the thigh, as we already explained at length in Parashat Chaye Sarah, that this, in an essay which I don't think we saw, that this is an oath upon the place of Brit Milah. Brit Milah gives expression to the Kedushat HaZerah, the holiness of seed, and the need. Hold on a second. Right there, Brit Milah was giving expression to the holiness of seed, and the need for Yitzchak to marry a woman who was not from the daughters of Canaan. And the oath upon the Brit Milah expresses there also kind of loyalty to the land which was given upon the covenant of Brit Milah at Abraham's, and that is expressed when Abraham says, "Raket beni lo tashev shama." Don't. The main thing to be sure about Eved Abraham is not to bring my son back to there, but he needs to stay in the land of Canaan. The oath of Yosef to Yaakov upon the Brit Milah also expresses the sanctity of seed in the continuation of the chain of the patriarchs, one after another. Burial is not just a dignified way to part from a corpse, right? For the community or family, the world to part from a corpse. It's also a declaration about the kind of connection of the patriarchs in covenant with the land, specifically with the earth, I should say, with the earth in the land of God's favor, God's delight. Right. So burial isn't, just going to put that in other words, burial is more than just a ritual of parting, but it also says something about the place of burial. It connects the body to the place of burial, and testifies to a connection between the life of the person and whatever that place is where they're being buried, to greater or lesser degrees in any given circumstance, but it certainly has the opportunity to do that and should be thought about in that sense. In the future, it can, or it will, create a kind of a continuity or a flow between the life and then the death of the three patriarchs in the land of the Lord, between that and the return of their children to that land after the exile from in Egypt, right? They sort of like, this is not the right term, but they're like literally placeholders. They are marking in their deaths, they are kind of maintaining the place and the connection to the land while their descendants have departed from the land, been exiled from the land, and holding it until they return. And indeed, this is what the sages expounded in the first encounter between those who left Egypt and the land of their ancestors, right, which is the story of the scouts. Vaya'alu v'negev vayavo ad Hebron. They went up, came up through the Negev, and the highly commented upon change from the plural to the singular, and one came to Hebron. And Rashi says, Kalev levado halach sham. Why did he go there? And he prostrated himself on the graves of his ancestors. And there, the circle is closed, which began with Yosef's departure from his father's house. going, not knowing at the time, but we the readers know at the time, headed down to Egypt, right, which is Vayishlachehu me'emek Chevron. There, Yaakov and Yosef at the time are in Hebron, and he sends him from there. And that, I mean, there are many beginnings to that story, but that's the last time Yosef sees home on his way down to Egypt, and so arguably that's the beginning of the Jewish people's departure from the land of Canaan, even if Yaakov and the rest of his sons remain there for some significant number of years. But that's the beginning of the journey of the next generation that will ultimately all go down to Egypt. They leave from Emek Hebron, and as they begin to return, the first returner, Kalev, goes back to Hebron. And we already explained at length in Parashat Vayechi that Emek Hebron is Marat HaMachpelah, and Yaakov and Yosef. I don't believe we saw this one either. I should always check these beforehand, but I don't remember learning this one. I could say it that way. Yaakov and Yosef went down to pray there before they parted with each other for those 22 years. And so this is not just the general region for Rav Meidan, but this is specifically kind of Marat HaMachpelah centrally. The connection between the graves of the matriarchs and the return to the land from exile also finds its expression in Nehemiah's wish, the butler of the king of Paras and Madai, to his king Artaxerxes at the time when he wants to come back from Galut to the land, right? So now we come also full circle in the Tanakh from Vayechi to Nehemiah, pretty close to the very, very end of the Tanakh. And I said to the king, if it's favorable to the king, and if it's good in his eyes, if your servant is good in your eyes, that you send me to Yehuda, to Ir Kivrot Avotai, to the city of the burial of my fathers, my ancestors, the Evnena, and I will build it up. The return to the land is the return to the burial place of our ancestors, right? It's just, just interesting. I mean, he's going to come to this in a moment, but it's interesting to think about what constitutes our own connections to the land of Canaan, now the land of Israel, right? The more it becomes, and obviously already is, but as it continues to be a vibrant, thriving, modern nation, we have many more conduits of connection to it. When it was, desolate from the perspective of the Jewish community, then what remained there as the point of connection were the graves of ancestors. I guess in certain ways, and it's not necessarily the best parallel, but in certain ways, like the lands of Eastern Europe, although their Jewish communities are growing again, for many people, the only points of connection are the points of connection there to dead ancestors. So the return to the land is the return to the graves of ancestors. Except at the end, Nehemiah actually asks to go to Yerushalayim Yokachenu, the holy city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the city of the revelation of God on Mount Moriah. It continues in our consciousness, the stand at Sinai, the place where God revealed God's self to the land of Israel. So the people of Israel, rather, the nation of Israel, right? So Nehemiah winds up reaching out for Jerusalem, but still, Rav Meidan comes back now to kind of dwell literally or figuratively on the Hebron idea. Together with this, and despite the significance of Jerusalem, Hebron ultimately is the city of the patriarchs. That's where they lived, and that's where they were buried, right? So when we think about the various historical and holy places in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, going back biblically to Genesis, it's not Yerushalayim, it really is Hebron. Our ongoing, and I think it's important what Rav Meidan is pointing out here, and what, I don't always necessarily pay attention to these details, but they really are true, that not for the entirety of their lives by any stretch, but for significant portions of their lives, the Avot lived in Hebron. That's where they lived, and indeed that's where they were buried. Our, continuing tradition and legacy of the path of God to do righteousness and justice, derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, which we learn from our ancestors, or pretty much literal quote from the early prakim of Genesis, where God talks about why God chooses Abraham. Our continuing tradition, ongoing tradition that emerges from their faith in God, under all conditions and without boundary. The ongoing tradition that we have and receive from them of their love of our Holy Land is nourished maybe is best from Hebron. The impressive Jewish continuity which is preserved in the city of Hebron over the long years of our exile, and the yearning for it in every place and under all circumstances, expresses all those things express the importance of our inner awareness, our inner consciousness of our being the children of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Sarah, Rivka, Rachel is put in parentheses because she's not buried there, and Leah, and the continuers of their tradition and their way of faith. So if we had Rav Meidan on, we would ask him his political attitude. What does this impact a political thought about how we should relate to Hebron today? And I don't actually know what he would say. I think it can be read connected or disconnected. It can be read as a statement about what the religious historic significance of this city is, irrespective of anything, or it could be read more politically. And I don't actually know what Rav Meidan's take is, and I'd be curious to know. But I think it's a beautiful bringing together, as he does so often, of kind of the different strands of Hebron's place from the beginning of Tanakh to the end of Tanakh. It's sort of holding it in, I don't know if call tension, but in a certain way, tension with Yerushalayim, and reminding us that that's prominent in Yaakov's mind as he is preparing to die, and that kind of sort of strong block of ancestral history, which the bulk of Genesis fills up and lives in, carries with Bnei Yisrael through the rest of their journeys through the Tanakh and history until today. Thoughts, questions, comments? Lance, go ahead.
Two things. One, my understanding is that today, H1 Hebron, which is the Palestinian territory of Hebron, is much larger than the Jewish, has Kentucky Fried Chicken. And the other point is, by the way, if you're someone who thinks that Israel's apartheid, you ought to go there, find out how H1 Hebron is supplying Israel with tremendous amount of goods and services. But it's apartheid. Anyway, I just want to read this passage from our Torah portion. It says, "But Joseph said to them," and I don't think this is in the essay, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives."
Mm-hmm.
So that there is a plan. God has a plan, and in a certain sense, I think that's almost, for me at least, the core of Judaism, because we have no idea what the plan is, but obviously Joseph has tremendous faith in God in a sense that he sees what God is doing. He's aware of it. He's conscious of it, and he's a part of it. And because his brothers are coming to him and saying, you're going to make me a slave or whatever, don't worry about it. I'm not going to hurt you. God is with me. And if you go back to the key moment where he talks about the interpretation of dreams, he's not interpreting the dreams. God is.
Yeah. Beautiful. What chapter and verse is that? I think I see it here. It's 50, 20.
19 and 20 in chapter 50.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
almost at
passage.
the end.
I'm just gonna pull it up in for a minute. Right. This is the context here is after they come back from the burial, they have Yosef's brothers have the fear that now that Yaakov is dead, Yosef, will give voice to the grudge that he must still carry. And so they so the way most of the commentaries read it fabricate this story. We only know that we don't have evidence, in the script of the Tanakh of this having taken place, but they send this message, and the sages use this as an indication that you can mishanim mipnei hashalom, change things for the sake of peace when needed. They send this message to Yosef saying that before he died, our father told us to, tell you to forgive, and so therefore please forgive. And Yosef was emotional, and they're ready to be his slaves. And this is then the quote that you quoted, Lance, comes in. Am I a substitute for God? Or a line that Yaakov used in a way that the sages and Rav Meidan picked up on this when we learned it, also saw as insensitive to Rachel when she was saying, give me children or I'll die. And he says, Hatachat Elohim ani, am I a substitute for God? Here Yosef is saying it, not out of exasperation, but out of humility, and ultimately God's plan was for good. I think the little phrase here, lahachayot am rav, is just a fascinating phrase. Right, it's just an interesting kind of theology, right? Up until now, I think what we've heard from Yosef is, we heard it already in Vayigash, that it's God put this in motion. Not just this was one long complex plan so that Yosef would be okay, but actually that Yosef was an agent of saving many lives and sustaining many people. And it's I think it's a nice recognition that in this moment, Yosef sees God as concerned with the welfare of all people, or many, many people, beyond the family of Hebrews that he's born into. Right, then he moves back to sort of assuring his brothers that he will take care of them, but it seems like the broader picture that he's opening up here is a God who manipulates the world in order ultimately to make sure that people can survive and be okay, which is nice.
I'd like to just point out that in this case, we see an example of how God creates both good and evil.
Interesting, yes.
And which destroys dualism. And, right. The rabbis have too, but mostly, the idea that there's a battle between good and evil. And what you see here is, that the other thing that I thought about was substituting for God. That's the divine right of kings. And the Pope, for example, is a substitute of God. Pope who just died is, not much of a substitute. But anyway, what Joseph is saying is there is no substitute for God.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well said. Any other questions or comments before we say goodbye to Rav Meidan for now and Chazak V'nit Chazek for Sefer Bereshit? David L., go for it.
If we have a few minutes. Lance took us on a little bit of a journey there. And I just wanted to share the words of Rabbi Dan's teacher, of Yoel Ben Nun, who, because the psukim that you've cited, Lance, actually invite the question as to whether Yosef believes this or whether Yosef is saying this to make his brothers feel better. And what Yoel Ben Nun points out is that God doesn't speak to Yosef once he enters the court. And in fact, God doesn't speak to Moshe when he's in the court. And he gives a really Zionist take on it, that Jews can succeed in other places, but they can't have a spiritual relationship with God. The relationship has to happen either in the desert or in Eretz Yisrael, but it can't happen within a foreign society. So after learning that from Rav Yoel, I've always thought that Yosef is making the brothers feel better, or Yosef is hearkening back to a much earlier period of the dreams, and saying that, this is how God communicated to me my destiny for greatness and my destiny for a universal vision, actually, that's going to go beyond this family. And it is it's a very, very loaded, very rich passage there that can be interpreted in multiple ways. I do think that Rav Stephen, your generous reader Rav Meidan, seeing the ambiguity of his language about the part of the land that nurtured and nursed our people. I think I have a better sense of what Rav Meidan thinks about the Yeshuv in Hebron. And what's sort of really interesting is, and I would really be interested to hear him talk about the geographical evolution of Bnei Yisrael, going from Hebron, going to Egypt, going to Shiloh, then Yerushalayim, then going to Yavne, then going to Bavel. And I guess the counterpart for Bavel was, I may be totally mistaken, but was as much Tiberia as anything else. But Hebron doesn't really resurface, to my knowledge, as a center of Jewish life, really until the Yeshuv comes back in the 20th century. It's a very, I can't think of a nicer word than romantic. What's the word, Sally? Okay, it's a romantic or a fundamentalist connection, jumping back into Jewish history. I wonder what Rav Meidan would say about that.
Great. I hope someone's been keeping a list of the questions we want to ask him in case we have the opportunity. Great. That's a pleasure. And we ended close to our theoretical projected time. And great to learn together. And we'll be back on, God willing, next week. I got a private chat reminding us that tomorrow is a fast day. Maybe a good fast for those who are fasting. Don't fast if you shouldn't fast. Always available if you need anything. And Laila Tov, love to mom and dad and all. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, thank you very much.
Thank you.